could make it. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I hope that's what. Is it worth me saying just a word or two? I'll
Yeah,
be very brief, Craig.
go for it.
By way of intro, I mean maybe just to get us going. I don't know how many times I've heard during the course of my now rather too long career about this is the moment for renewal. In some ways, what that leads me to conclude is now always the time for renewal. But I do think, in the light of what we've all had to live through um, over the past 12 months, that there is a real opportunity, a more than usually great opportunity for us to rethink and perhaps refresh the key pillars of all that we do. In fact, we've already seen a good deal of that renewal already happen. We've seen governments, the state, rethink and renew their role, of necessity, ensuring many more people in many more ways than it probably ever has previously, whether that's individuals or businesses or whole sectors. We've seen the market, private companies renewing themselves, rethinking their social contract with their workers, with their customers, with their clients, with the communities in which they operate, and indeed with wider society. And we've seen, haven't we, just as much rethinking and renewal within civil society, broadly defined, also over the course of the past 12 months, playing the vital role we know it all plays in stitching together the different segments and sectors of society, particularly those that are least advantaged or most vulnerable, of whom there've obviously been a huge number over the course of the last 12 months. And I suppose the fourth renewal we've seen over the last 12 months has been a renewal of the partnership between those three, between the market, the state, and civil society. We've seen them often operating hand in glove in an overtly coordinated fashion to serve the economy, to serve communities, to serve societies. And for me, there are a few better examples of that than the vaccination program, which I think combined the very best of government, including, of course, crucially, the NHS, with the very best of the private sector in terms of their capacity to innovate, invent, and indeed manufacture, with the very best of the voluntary sector in the crucial role they have played in getting jabs into people's arms. And if we wanted we shouldn't have needed another example of the brilliance and the power of market, state, and voluntary sector working together in partnership, but we've had one over the last 12 months, and we are all we've all hugely benefited from that being the case. So I do think there is a lot to build on there. I'm hopeful that we can build on that. My starting position, Craig, here, as you know, as someone who knows me well, is of those three pillars. We spend a lot of our time thinking about the market and how to get that functioning better, quite a lot of time thinking about the state and how to get government functioning better, but too little focus on the third pillar, on civil society, which for me is equally important, and its strength is plainly equally important if indeed we are to build back not just better, but greener and fairer and kinder, which I know is something everyone on this call would agree with. So perhaps I can stop there and pass back to you, Craig. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy, and I think that's prefaced really well. I think where I wanted to kick off the conversation today, and because I guess we've as a sector we've been part of the response to the pandemic, and we're now in the runway out of it. But I guess I'd be really interested in your view as somebody who's got sort of one foot in the civil society sector and one foot in the rest of the world, as it were. What's your view of how the sector one has responded to the crisis, and two, what we what we've learned from it going forward, and what this sector can, the role the sector can play in the different world that you just talked about in the last passage. What's your take on those questions from what you know about our sector in the last year?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I'm really not saying this to flatter those on the call, but you all should be flattered by what I'm about to say, which I think there's absolutely no question in mind, no question whatsoever, that civil society, the charitable sector, voluntary sector, social sector, whatever you want to call it, has without question been one of the unsung heroes of the last 12 months of the COVID crisis. Of course, there have been heroes aplenty over the course of the last 12 months, some sung and some relatively unsung. NHS get lots of the plaudits, social care somewhat less. Um, I would say the charity sector, voluntary sector, somewhat less still, and perhaps 'twas ever thus. Nonetheless, it's absolutely clear from everything I've seen, everything I've read, everything I've heard, that were it not the case that charities had risen to the challenge of helping those most vulnerable, worst affected by this crisis, we'd have been in a far, far, far worse situation. That the social fabric has held together is in no small part down to the efforts of the social sector, and not just the formal parts. I mean, plainly, charities have ridden to the rescue in a very significant scale. You know, some of the surveys we've been doing at Pro Bono suggest that the demand for the services of charities have gone up, 20, 30, 40% over the course of the last year. At the same time, as the finances of those same charities have been squeezed by often similar sorts of percentages, which is, you know, a difficult configuration when the demand for what you do is going through the roof, and the supply of financing to do those things is falling. Nonetheless, that is, I think, the situation large parts of the charity sector have found themselves in. But I think every bit as important has been those informal groups, those mutual aid groups, those community groups, those faith groups that have come together to provide their crucial support as well. So, as I say, this without this, I think would have been looking at a far, far worse situation. Indeed, perhaps one in which would have seen a significantly greater degree of civil discontent and unrest than we have seen over the course of the last 12 months. I should say, none of us, I imagine, are surprised by that. And certainly no one should have been surprised by that, because actually that is the role the social sector has always played at times of significant societal stress, as I've said elsewhere, as that kind of crucial counter-cyclical stabilizer, societal stabilizer at these times. And that's been never more in evidence than over the course of the last 12 months. Plainly, that difficult 12 months has also revealed some vulnerabilities in the sector. One of them is financial, which I just mentioned. A big financing gap for the sector has opened up. At Pro Bono, we've estimated that to be, of the order of £10 billion. And even in this day and age, where money doesn't mean what it used to be, that's still, a decent chunk of change to be looking to fill. I'd say in that case, what we saw revealed was, many of the pre-existing fragilities in the financing of parts of the charity sector in particular. And that is plainly something we need to return to in providing a less fragile financing platform looking ahead. So definitely some lessons, not least financial lessons, but my overriding impression, from some little distance, is that the third sector has played a blinder.
Thanks, and I'm sure people are pleased to hear that, Andy. And thinking about the future, because you just alluded to this sort of counter-cyclical cohesion kind of function that the sector tends to play. Now, the period we're going into, we don't know how it's going to play out in terms of exactly, but we do know that inequalities have grown in health and economic terms. We know that there's an intended levelling up agenda, which is probably more long term than short term in character. But I guess what's sitting underneath this is the idea that to be successful as an economy and a nation, we have to have a strong society. What's your view on the capacity and role of the civil society sector, the voluntary sector, in contributing to that in the future? You know, are we anywhere near being able to make the kind of contribution that might be needed to get this society back into or into the shape it needs to be in to be long term successful in your view?
Yeah, yeah. Um, some big questions in there, Craig. I doubt I'll be able to provide big enough answers, but let me have a first go, and then we can broaden the conversation. I mean, as you say, we entered the COVID crisis already with yawning inequalities and inequities along most dimensions. Yeah, certainly income and wealth and generational and opportunity and spatial, the geographic dimension, the leveling up dimension that you mentioned. Most, if not all of those, will have been made somewhat worse by the events of the past 12 months. Certainly, um, along the dimension of income and wealth, that strikes me as very likely. Along the dimension of generation, even more likely. Um, and ditto on opportunity. On the spatial, on the geographic, it's a bit less clear, to be honest, because funnily enough, some of the hardest hit places across the UK have been the big cities. I mean, London, central London, is, I mean, not quite a dust bowl, but it's not what it was, let's be honest. So it's a slightly nuanced picture geographically, but nonetheless, it's unlikely any of those inequalities will have been improved by the last 12 months, and many will have been made, I think, materially worse. In terms of how we tackle those and what role civil society has within those, I mean, I am in favor of as far as possible, a very localized approach if we are to tackle those on a durable basis, not just for tackling leveling up generally, but actually in tackling many of these problems. I think, what do I say that? I mean, I think local knowledge is absolutely crucial
Yes.
to tackling what are often very local problems. I think local agency is crucial too. You know, people feeling they have the powers and the responsibilities to tackle these issues for themselves. I think local institutions are therefore crucial to
Yes.
making those things
Yes.
happen. So, you know, that rather different model of capitalism, um, what elsewhere I've called community capitalism,
Mm.
to stress its
Yes.
kind of local nature.
Yes.
You know, therein lie, you know, for me, some of the roots of success. Because if I go back to that model of a kind of partnership between market, state, and civil society, you know, that means combining the efforts and coordinating the efforts of schools, of our HE and FE sector, of local government, of transport systems, of business, of local community and faith groups, of local charities. Funnily enough, trying to do that at a national top-down level is impossible. We know that because we haven't ever successfully done that in the UK. The only successful examples we've seen of that degree of coordination has been at the local level. which
Yes.
also works in terms of local knowledge and local agency.
Yes.
So, for me, the key to renewal and restoration would be this more locally focused, overtly coordinated
Mm.
through local institutions model of growth to tackle those long-standing
Yes.
inequalities within which civil society would have an absolutely front and center role alongside private institutions, alongside local government, alongside
Yes.
education, training, and skills. So that's a slightly general answer, but
Yes.
I think it requires a slightly general solution.
Yeah, and I'm inferring that sort of devolution is part of that mix. Not just political devolution, but fiscal devolution as well. I just want to bring in one or two people who've been on the chat. Scott Darragh is a social entrepreneur from Greater Manchester and very involved in the some of the stuff Andy Burnham's doing up there. And I just wonder, Scott, if you might want to just kind of give some life to that, just to it might give a feel to Andy for what's happening at the local level in GM. Are you there, Scott?
I am there, yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Craig. Yeah, thanks, Andy. There's some really great insights into into the challenges that we're facing and the opportunities in Greater Manchester this week. Actually, they've just launched the Inequalities Commission report, which is a really interesting read. I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at that, but that has been part of the Social Enterprise Advisory Group, which I've sat on in GM, has been around creating a landscape where social enterprises can thrive, and what kind of economic, social, and kind of systematic kind of approaches we need within GM to allow social enterprises to be front and center of the kind of policy. And I think what they've done they've got three different kind of bodies that are meeting. There's the Social Enterprise Advisory Group, the Inequalities Commission, and also Cooperatives Commission, and they're looking really how, in terms of policy, they can create a landscape where the civil society sector can really kind of thrive. And I guess one of the challenges, really, I think with the rhetoric that we're hearing, Boris Johnson's been very praising of, the innovation, flexibility, and can-do spirit of the sector during COVID. But what's not really happening at the moment, I think there's a bit of a disconnect with policy. And one of the questions from me is just a little bit about how we can kind of work with government to make sure that in the great COVID reset, we actually make sure that these things are hardwired into policy, so that the landscape, not just in GM but across the whole of the UK, can really allow social enterprises to thrive.
Mm.
I don't think that the policy necessarily kind of
Mm.
represents that at the moment.
Great question, Scott. Lastly, how do we hardwire some of this into the political post-COVID response, social enterprise, and the voluntary sector, Andy?
Yeah, well, thank you, Scott. And the work you mentioned that's going on in GM sounds fantastic. I've seen some of that firsthand myself. In fact, when I mentioned that model of cooperation, I mean, I think the part of the UK that comes, part of England at least, that comes closest to achieving that right now is GM. Built up in their case over many years. It predates Andy B. It's back to Howard Bernstein and Richard Lees actually, and bring those institutions together over 10, 15 years to get to where GM currently is. Unfortunately, almost every other part of the country is behind, and in many cases a long way behind where Greater Manchester is currently. I haven't seen that Inequalities Commission report, Scott, so I'll definitely dig that out and take a look. So I can't speak with any authority about that, but it sounds just the job. I mean, the point you raise about the policy disconnect is neither surprising, but it's not surprising, and it's also painfully familiar. If you look through, the budget from a few weeks ago, or indeed the plan for growth that accompanied it, there wasn't very much mention of local actors, and there wasn't very much mention indeed of civil society as part of that plan for growth. So I think that the risks you raise of policy disconnect are real. I think there are some encouraging straws in the wind. I thought Danny Kruger's review from a little while back was making some of the right noises about giving civil society a position of somewhat greater prominence in these debates than has been the case in the past, although it remains to be seen, which bits of Danny's review will actually be taken forward in practice. If I could make just one, as an outsider looking in and take this comment in that spirit, just one suggestion on this front, which would be that, I think sometimes the sector has not made as much of the advantage that might come from working together with the market and together with the state. I think maybe too often it can come across as a bid for monies, give us more money and we'll do the right thing, rather than as thinking about what would be that partnership that would help benefit both sides. I think that has made sometimes for a slightly antagonistic relationship between parts of civil society and parts of government, which I think is the last thing that we need right now. But I'm not assigning blame for that, by the way. I just think there are some bridges that need building on that, and the asks needs to be more than money, I think, for those bridges to be built, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. We have some people on the call who might have thoughts around it. I want to yeah. There's a few comments coming up. I want to bring in Liam Cahill, and this is on a sort of related topic. I think Liam's been basically been working with NHSX on and the whole digital response to COVID and how that intersects with the community sector, and he's had a few comments and observations which he shared on chat, which I just invite you, Liam, to briefly put and put into a question for Andy if you can as well. That'd be lovely. Liam Cahill from Sector 3 Digital.
I will remove the fawning on his speech on ideas and institutions, which was brilliant. Oh no, it just is. Last year I was working with NHS England, and I did a lot of work with social enterprises, just looking at how they're getting access to resources, particularly those who kind of spun out from the system or providing quite big sort of very different kind of function arrangements within the service. And I think what we saw is that within the NHS's narrative, often they promote and champion the role of social enterprise as civic institutions, and yet in real time, particularly around how funding is allocated, quite often they are structurally undermined. And I suppose, just as a question to sort of change what I initially put, because I think we're building on what the last points is, do we feel that there is a place for larger kinds of social enterprises at the dovetail between the health institution and these kind of civic enterprises? And if so, what are your thoughts on what we can kind of do about it so we can improve that dovetail in the relationship itself?
So something about the intersection between the big health service, the formal and official health service, and the organisations that bridge that are part of our sector, that bridge between the NHS and civil society. How can we grow and expand these organisations in I think is part of that.
Yeah, so I think this is Liam, very interesting, and by the way, fawn away. That's more than permitted. I think you raise a really really big question, in the following sense, which I've been giving too little thought to say anything really coherent. But let me tell you where my thinking is, so I can kind of pose the question back to you, and you perhaps help me solve it. Right now we have this quite hard and fast distinction between those companies that are said to have a charitable purpose, and which benefit from a tax exemption as part of that, and private companies that by implication are therefore not deemed to have a charitable purpose, and therefore do pay tax. And I just wonder whether that and sort of social enterprises sit somewhere between the two on that front. They sit in the kind of middle ground between the two. And if we do want, many more of our private businesses to be socially purposed, to have something that's more akin to a charitable purpose, is this black-white, hard and fast distinction between that those do and those don't, or those that do pay tax and those that don't pay tax? Is that a sensible one to maintain? Where in actual fact, we have a spectrum of business models here, perhaps serving, a graduated scale of social purpose. And if you think that's true, which I think probably is true, then a very binary distinction between them, whether in words or in the way that they pay tax, may not actually be very helpful. It may prevent a kind of porosity between these different business models that inhibits them being set up. So my half-formed thought, actually, it's much less than half. The fraction is much lower than half, which is why I'm throwing it out to the room. Really, is as well as thinking about these different organizational forms with different titles like charity or social enterprise or private company, whether we should think about a rather less binary set of distinctions and a rather different set of treatments, whether it's tax or otherwise, so that we can nurture more of the good stuff, where the good stuff here is social purpose. So Liam, I don't think that's remotely answering your question, but what I am suggesting is a kind of rethinking of corporate form and where it comes from is, I think, overdue. That was true anyway pre-COVID, right? Because many private businesses were trying to, as we know, and very helpfully trying to make themselves more purposeful for ESG type reasons. But actually, that's a rather narrow lens on this problem. I think, we should go to the core of how we classify firms of different types and how indeed we tax those firms of different types. Thank
you, Andy. David Halpern is here from Behavioural Insights, who I think you probably know. But I had a question about social capital, but I think I'm going to let David put it in because it's very similar. David, are you still there? Are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Hi, David. Yeah. Over to you.
Hi, thanks. So yeah, Andy, I mean, you obviously know some of the social capital literature, but the sort of social trust measures. If we had Swedish-style levels of mutual trust, which by the way also turns out to be a key predictor of decays in compliance with social distancing across countries, but that we'd have, well, I think by some estimates, about 8% higher GDP if we could do it, because of how it flows, information through economies, et cetera, et cetera. It may be done at a kind of micro level, local level, and gradually built up. But given the national differences are so pronounced, it does suggest that it is possible to try and do it in a bigger way, like some of the conversations you've been in around not just national citizen service, but should we try and create similar things which are almost kind of collective events that create bridging? John Yates has made the argument when you have a child, and we should fund cohorts of parents to have kind of form a little village, or when people retire, to support cohorts of people to do this together. So they would be deliberate attempts to try and move the sort of social trust variables we know bears directly on growth. Anyway, what do you think?
Thanks, David.
Thanks, David. Nice to see you. Now, I answered this question with some trepidation. I believe, David, you've written a book on social capital, have you not?
I have, but it's a little rusty. But yeah, sure. but you're running the bank.
Yes. Well, listen. I think all the ideas that you mentioned there, and many more besides, are absolutely well. First things first. I mean, as you know, David, and many on this call will know. Even the notion of what social capital is, how you might begin to get your arms around the measuring of it, that will be alien to, I don't know what fraction of the population, but I'm guessing the vast majority of the population. And indeed, the S in ESG is the letter that's least advanced, yes. Even within the corporate sector as well. So we've got quite some way to go just to define what we're talking about, and indeed to measure what we're talking about, and to have a wider set of people understand the value of what we're talking about, because not everyone has read David's book, regrettably, or at least not yet. I think your point about building good habits at the earliest possible stage around this in schools is absolutely crucial. Having this be a even more central part of the curriculum than is the case right now. I think there's bits and bobs of this in PSHE, but I don't think it's remotely sufficient to inculcate that habit early on. You know, that the spirit of, for example, volunteering or doing things in your community, you know, for me, should be absolutely front and center from the earliest stage of schooling. And indeed, then having that as a jobs pathway. I mean, right now we have, I mentioned the three pillars: your market, government, public, private, and third sector. I mean, there's a bit of crisscrossing in people's career pathways between the public and private sector, but very, very little between the third sector and the other two pillars. And that strikes me as a massive opportunity missed. And indeed, one of the reasons why we don't get more partnership between the three in practice. So defining, you know, a better defined career pathway for those who want to do spend time in the third sector, or indeed spend time volunteering, I think would be neat. I've been struck, and I'm sure you've seen some of this stuff yourself, David, at some of the huge value. For example, you mentioned the example of you're bringing people together, younger people or older people. The examples of bringing both younger and older people together can generate even larger amounts of social capital there. Because in some ways, and this is the point that, you know, lots of people have made, what the last 100 years have done is kind of break that generational link between grandparents and grandchildren, which from a social capital perspective, we all know is among the most important source of social capital in terms of the reciprocal benefits that both older and younger people can bring. So I do think, you know, your examples and many others besides of ways in which we could actively, through interventions, generate social capital, and those means, I think, very much welcome. We aren't really having that conversation, are we?
No. Well,
I don't think we're really having that conversation in quite those terms right now. And I think that's in part because even the social capital concept is seen as being kind of rather ethereal. And although the ONS, as you know, have made some efforts to begin to measure this on a more systematic basis, truth is it's not in the bloodstream of corporates, and it's not really in the bloodstream of economies and societies just yet, and that needs a nudge.
Yeah, that was what I was about to kind of ask you about, Andy, because obviously the measurement, when you said ESG, is S is the one that's seeing least action. It's because probably environmental measures are easier to quantify, social capital not. Obviously, you've just said now that in your view this is somewhat ethereal, not in the bloodstream. Is this because it's just inherently elusive, or do you, from your kind of economist perspective, see a point in the not too distant future where we can quantify social capital such that it can be represented in the national accounts as something that's as valid and important as every other economic as every other feature of the economy?
Well, I certainly think, you know, we could do a much better job, Craig, than we have so far, not just in measuring it, but in socializing that concept to a much broader extent than was the case. I mean, quite a lot of progress has been made on this front over the last, you know, 10 or 15 years. So we aren't starting with a blank piece of paper remotely, you know, as David and you and others will know. But this is still seen as being a bit on the periphery, a bit on the fringes of what we do, whether it's among companies in the company reporting or in our economies, in our national accounts reporting. And if there were a time to move that forward, it is now, and not just on social capital, I should say.
No.
You know, absolutely the same could be said of natural capital. Just the same could be said of institutional capital. these are all things that all the evidence would suggest are crucial drivers of mass flourishing of economies and societies.
Yes.
Our measurement of them is somewhere behind. It is measurement of physical capital or financial capital, or indeed even human capital. Even that's kind of work in progress. But we know that the secret source of mass flourishing is that plurality of capitals, at least the six I mentioned, and probably a few more besides. So not yet there, much further forward than would have been the case 10, 15, certainly 20 years ago, but what better time than now to give that a rethink.
Yes, I think that's well put about that flourishing of multiple types of capital. I don't know if you probably may have seen John Kampfner's recent book called Why the Germans Do It Better, and there's a chapter in there all about it's about social capital, but also the human capital that as a society they seem to have done so much better at than us in terms of consciously nurturing it over many decades, actually, and such that the society is more cohesive and is better able to respond to things like the refugee crisis, for example, than we are. And so I don't think you have to look that far really to see how to do some of this. What's your take on? You may or may not have read the book, but what's your take on that view that there actually are some pretty high functioning societies that have got this stuff a bit better than us within a short distance?
Yeah, I think that I haven't read the book, so I can't speak for the book, I'm afraid, Craig.
Thanks.
But the message that you just proceed certainly sounds a pretty plausible one to me. And of course, the same could be said of a number of economies and societies around the world. Certainly parts of Scandinavia are often a role model of a rather different redrawing of the social contract than that which we have in parts of the Anglo-Saxon West. I imagine David's been following this closely as well, the journey that New Zealand have been on, and the kind of reorientation and reconfiguration of how they think about not just structuring their interventions, but the objectives they set themselves in structuring those policy interventions, putting issues of subjective well-being or happiness in the lingo, or kindness in the language that's often used, much more center stage when keeping score on whether policy has been successful or not. So I don't think we're no longer looking just at Bhutan as an example of well-being being given a position of prominence. Increasingly, I think that is finding force elsewhere around the world. I mentioned some of the countries where I think that's true.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to bring others in a second, but I was just referring back to an earlier passage. You were talking about what sounded like a need to look at organisations a bit differently. When I started my career in the voluntary sector, the three sectors were very, 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 very distinct. You wouldn't often find someone working in a charity who'd worked in a business or anything like that. I definitely see more what we might call hybrid organisations now, and I think those are best captured in the better social enterprises, which are sort of very commercial in their approach, but highly social, obviously, in their objectives. And we're also seeing a lot more businesses, as you alluded to, in the private sector that have been founded with social purpose very much at their core, not just as a kind of as an additional or peripheral thing. So I think that's something that will continue, and hopefully we'll see more of those type of organisations arising as we go on, and a further blurring of the distinctions between sectors. So yeah, that was just a thought on your thought before. I just want to change tack a little bit. We've got a question from Judith Brodie, who's a chief exec in the sector, and about risk and reserves, which sounded which sounded a good question to ask a banker. So Judith, over to you.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, I've been kicking around the voluntary sector for a fair number of years now, and I just ponder the relationship between risk and reserves and the attitudes to it among our boards, but also in the wider context and among funders. And I don't know what the answer is, but I just wonder if there is a resetting that we might want to do or want to think about in terms of the attitudes to risk and reserves in the non-profit sector, but particularly the charity side of that sector, which can be very risk averse and is damned if they hold too much reserves, and obviously having reserves helps you innovate. So but also damned if you don't have enough reserves, because obviously that constrains your resilience. So it's like, there's so many issues here. How do you educate boards? How do you think this through? I suppose I wonder also if the partnerships that you've been sort of alluding to cross-sector might play a role in this resetting, in that if there's more risk sharing, more financial backup for innovation, that sort of thing. So sorry, it's a little bit of a vague question, but that's what I'm interested in.
Thanks, Judith. And
Thanks, Judith.
Reflections? Yeah.
Well, I think it's a very good question. I don't think of myself as a banker, by the way, Judith, most of the time. I don't know, if you ask the public, what is the Bank of England? Roughly 50% say they're a bank, like a HSBC or a Barclays, and the other half think we're politicians, which is a rather unfortunate hybrid, actually, of sort of banker and politician, when we're neither, I hope. Your question now, I've seen this myself from having been involved as trustee of various charities over the year, just the sort of tensions that you mentioned, Judith, between the desire to be resilient and have enough for a rainy day on the one hand, but the desire to strike out and be innovative and on the other. I mean, part of the reconciliation or the resolution would come from a greater quantum of longer term funding than is currently the case, available to most charities. That currently isn't in as plentiful supply as I think might be the case from whether it's from private donors or indeed from some of the foundations, much less from government. I look at the funding pools that were made available in the budget, for example, for levelling up, and I don't think they are a role model in how to provide long-term financing security to local areas, much less civil society institutions within them. Is there some partnership model there that could help? I do think there's a lot more help that could be provided in kind through skills and expertise to the trustee boards of charities in helping think through these tricky financial issues. I mean, it's very odd in a way that we in the UK pride ourselves in having a surplus of financial expertise in the economy as a whole, which we do. Some of it vested in the City of London, but actually scattered around many of our great cities. And yet, a great deficit of financial expertise when it comes to great swathes of households and indeed parts of the charity sector too. So I think there's more that the financial sector could do to share their expertise and knowledge with the third sector on how best to navigate things financially. I also think there's more that could be done by risk sharing between the public and private sector to help catalyze social innovation and social entrepreneurship of various types. I mean, this government has shown an appetite for those public-private partnerships, not least through its new agency, the Advanced Research and Inventions Agency. That's principally private sector focused, but if our sights could be broadened to think of this in terms of social innovation and social entrepreneurship, then the self-same model could be made to work.
Thank you, Andy. We've got probably time for one more question. I've had we've got Rob Fountain, who's the chief exec of Age Concern, Age UK rather, in Gloucestershire, asking a question really about how the sector can most successfully engage. So, Rob, if you're still there, love to hear from you.
Thanks, Craig, and hi, Andy. Andy knows Age UK Gloucestershire well, having come and spent a morning with us. I was just thinking on the big questions of tackling inequality, building back better. To my mind, that's going to require a lot more influencing, advocating, listening, particularly to voices that have been rarely heard. And that sounds like in your 3-pillar model, Andy, like the civil society would be key at making that happen. And yet on the surface, it strikes me that we've got, certainly in the charity sector, a regulator that doesn't think we should be lobbying. We've got a government that doesn't seem to listen, despite the best efforts of Carl and others who are on this call. And we've got a funding landscape that doesn't particularly want to put money into that sort of thing. It wants to put money into doing and delivering services. So I wonder if we're stuck, or if there's a new way of thinking about how do we do influencing and lobbying in a way that feels like it can be constructive and not combative.
Fabulous question, Rob. Thank you.
Hi, Rob, and that is a fabulous question and far too good a question for me to be able to provide adequate answer to. I think when I first started involving myself a little bit in the sector, understanding the sector, I too was struck by many of the points that you are now making. The parts of the economy that I knew a bit more about, which included the business sector, had many of those institutions or vehicles in place to pull together a collective view and to find means of getting that view into the government machine or into the policy mainstream. And that doesn't appear to be a loaves and fishes miracle that the civil society has yet been able to achieve. I don't know what the right institutional answer is to that. And actually, I'd be very interested in others' thoughts on how providing, a more coherent collective voice for the sector might be done. But it plainly is the case on the basis of what I've seen that voice is currently rather too quiet, insufficiently cohesive, and insufficiently compelling within government to break through as much as I'm sure we all agree it could and indeed should. Could other changes within the the kind of constitution of the cabinet that might make a difference to that? I think that is an interesting idea that might be worth giving a little bit of thought to. But I think if all the changes on the political side, that will perhaps be necessary, but plainly will not be sufficient, I think. And actually, something from within the sector itself is going to be equally important.
Just as a final thing, Andy, I wanted you to you're part of this forthcoming, it's current Commission on Civil Society, which Pro Bono Economics have been have set up. I think Gus O'Donnell is the chair, and so on. What's obviously you're in the foothills of this work. What would you like to see this commission achieve? What do you think should be its number one objective as a piece of work? What would help most, do you think, Andy? And then we'll have to bring things to a close.
Well, thanks for mentioning that, Craig. I think I was probably meant to, but managed to forget as ever. It's perils of old age. And it's got a slightly grand title, Commission on Civil Society. It sounds very grand. I apologise for that as well. It's also slightly misleading in the following sense, in that there have been, as everyone on this call knows, plenty of reviews, commissions of civil society over many years now. Having read a number of those, they all read and feel a little bit inside baseball, a little like the sector talking to itself about itself. and we were very keen that this was a little bit different in the following sense. We have taken commissioners from across the three pillars I started with, people in the private sector, people in government, people in academia, and people from the social sector. And that's because we want the commission not just to be about how the sector can do better, but as importantly, what is the rightful role of the market and of the state alongside the social sector? This is about where we draw the appropriate boundaries, or redrawing the boundaries for those three, and as crucially, how those three begin to work together and meld together to a much greater extent than has been the case in the past. So if I had one objective from the Commission, it would be that we wouldn't siloize, if that's a word, these three sectors in the way we have in the past, that issues of measurement across them become common rather than different. That what I think I mentioned early on, that the sometimes invisible residual that is the third sector becomes much more visible, and that speaks to measurement, but also is no longer thought about as third in the queue, as the residual, but rather as a front and center part of growing our economy. That has been intermittently the case at times in our history, especially our recent history, the last 250 years. But the tilt over the last 50 or 60 years has been that we've downplayed that third pillar, and the resurrection of that, both nationally and especially locally, that's what the Commission's about, I hope.
Yeah, fantastic. That's a really good response. And are we looking at something by the end of the year on the Commission, do you think? Is that when it's likely to report?
It's a two-year commission, and we look to rather than producing a weighty tome in 2 years' time that is instantly confined to the shelf or the dustbin, we'll look to dribble out our utterances and policy recommendations over the course of those 2 years. And maybe I could end on this, Craig. Very, very keen to engage as many of you who feel you might wish to engage with the Commission on this programme of work. We're not going with preordained answers. We're even going with preordained questions.
Yes.
So if you can help us think through the right questions and better still come up with some answers, we'd love to work together with you on those things.
We'll send out a link, Andy. I know you've got to jump now. Just want to say thank you so much. It's been a marvellous session, really, really good, and it's been lovely having you with us. I think everybody's really appreciated it. So thanks enormously, and have a great rest of day. But I know you've got to run off at 1:30 on the nail. So thanks so much, and
thanks,
bye
Craig.
for now. Cheers, Andy.
Thanks, Craig.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers
Pleasure.
now.